Hi everyone, this is Mr. Vanderpool. Now we've talked about one economic problem, which is unemployment. Now we're going to move on to another economic problem, which is called inflation. And inflation is just a rise in the price level in an economy. We're also going to talk a little bit about deflation, which is when the price level in an economy is going down, but our focus is mostly going to be on inflation. Inflation, particularly unanticipated inflation, is going to erode the value of money. It's going to arbitrarily redistribute wealth from creditors to debtors who can pay back their debts in less valuable dollars. And so we're going to talk about some of these side effects of inflation. We're going to talk about what inflation is, how to measure it, and so forth. So before we start talking about some of the details regarding inflation, I want to talk about inflation in its extreme, which is called hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is when you're going to start seeing the price level rising very, very quickly in the economy. You're going to see prices skyrocketing. Most economists consider hyperinflation to exist when prices are growing at more than 50% per month. And several years ago in Zimbabwe, you had hyperinflation, and prices were growing actually quite a bit faster than that. That actually forced Zimbabwe to create currencies that were in gigantic quantities. So, for example, here you have the $100 trillion bill from the Bank of Zimbabwe. And this is the kind of thing you're going to see when countries are suffering from inflation or hyperinflation. In order to kind of put this all in perspective, there were some reports coming out of Zimbabwe during this hyperinflation period that were saying that gas prices were doubling every single day. So you can imagine, let's say gas is at $4 a gallon today. Tomorrow it's at 8. The next day it's at 16. The next day it's at 32. The next day it's at 64. The next day it's at $128 per gallon. You can imagine how much that would disturb not only your own lifestyle, but the lifestyle of an entire economy. So hyperinflation and other high levels of inflation can be very, very destructive to an economy. So let's talk about inflation here. So inflation we're going to represent with the variable pi. It occurs when the economy's overall price level is rising. So some prices might be going down, but most prices are going up. So overall, the price level is going up. The inflation rate is going to be expressed by the variable pi percentage. That's the percentage change in the price level from one time period to another. So the percentage change in inflation. Now there's two causes of inflation. You have demand pull inflation, where you have too much money chasing too few goods. Usually this comes from too much aggregate demand, where people are bidding up the prices of goods. You also have cost push inflation. This is when input costs go up for businesses, and so they push up their prices. So let's say the price of oil and gas goes up. That's a big input for businesses. And if they have to pay more for gas to transport stuff, for example, they might start moving up the prices of their products to make up for that. So that is cost push inflation. Those are the cost push, demand pull. Those are the two causes of inflation. Now, next I want to talk about the metric that most economists use to measure inflation. That is the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is a very, very common index to measure inflation. So the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, is a measure of the overall cost of goods and services bought by a typical consumer. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports the CPI each month. I actually have a friend that works for the Bureau of Labor Statistics and does exactly this. And it's used to monitor changes in the cost of living over time. So if the CPI is going up, a family has to spend more to maintain their standard of living. Now let's see how this CPI, Consumer Price Index, is calculated. So the first thing the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to do is they're going to fix the basket. They're going to determine what prices are most important to the typical consumer. And this is important because the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to be following how the prices of these goods are changing. So if they are following the prices of goods that people don't buy typically, then the CPI measurement is not going to be accurate. So they need to figure out what are people buying, and then they're going to follow the prices of those goods. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics identifies a market basket of goods and services that the typical consumer buys. They'll set weights for those goods and services as well. So what's in the CPI's basket? About 41% housing, 4% other goods and services, 4% apparel, 6% recreation, 6% medical care, 6% education and communication, 17% transportation, 16% food and beverages. Now, next step is to find the prices. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics is going to figure out the basket, then they're going to find the prices of those goods and services. So they're going to find the prices of each of these goods and services for a basket at each point in time. So they'll go around to various sellers and they will figure out what are the prices of these goods. So they go to Target, Walmart, etc. and find out what are these goods selling for. Next, they're going to go ahead and compute the basket's cost. So they're going to use the data on prices to calculate the cost of the basket of goods and services at different times. Then they're going to go ahead and choose a base year and compute the index. So let's talk about that a little bit. So they're going to designate 1 year as the base year. They're going to make it the benchmark against which other years are compared. And generally, that year is going to be given a value of 100. Then you're going to go ahead and compute the index by dividing the price of the basket in 1 year by the price in the base year and multiplying it by 100. Okay, so you can think of the CPI as the price of a basket in 1 year divided by the price of a basket in the base year, which generally will be an earlier year, but not always. And then you're multiplying that by 100. Next step is to compute the inflation rate. So the inflation rate is the percentage change in the price index from the preceding period. So this is how it's calculated. So the inflation rate in year 2 is going to be equal to the CPI in year 2 minus CPI in year 1 divided by the CPI in year 1 times 100. So it's going to be the CPI in the later year minus the CPI in the earlier year divided by the CPI in the earlier year times 100. So for example, let's say the CPI in 2010 is 158 and the CPI in 1984 is 100. If you're going to throw this in here, the later year is 2010, so it would be 158 minus 100 divided by 100. You can run those in your notes there, run those numbers, you'll multiply by 100, you'll get 58% inflation rate. All right, so let's do another example here. So let's say we have a base year of 2002. And this is going to be not calculating the inflation rate, but the actual CPI. So our basket of goods in 2002 cost $1,200. In 2004, it costs $1,236. So what we're going to go ahead and figure out here is we're figuring out our CPI. Remember, that's the basket in 1 year divided by the basket in the base year. So the 1 year is generally going to be the later year. So that's going to be in your numerator. So it's going to be 1,236 divided by the price of the basket in the earlier year, which is $1,200. Then you multiply that by 100, and you get 103. So you can tell that prices increased 3% between 2002 and 2004. The easy way to figure that out is, remember, the base year is going to be classified as 100. So if you go from 100 to 103, you have a 3% growth in prices. All right, now, next what I want to do is I want to go ahead and give you some numbers here so you can see how the inflation rate and the CPI is calculated. So let's say, let's go through different steps. So the first one, we're going to survey customers to determine a fixed basket of goods. So the fixed basket of goods here is going to be 4 hot dogs, 2 hamburgers. That's what people are going to buy. This is a simplistic example, but it'll help us better understand. Now we're going to find the price of each good in a year. So 2001, you had $1 for the hot dogs, $2 for the hamburgers. 2002, $2 for the hot dogs, $3 for the hamburgers, and so forth. Now the next step is to compute the cost of the basket of goods in each year. So basically you're going to take the price of the hot dogs times the number that they're buying and the type and the cost of the hamburgers during that year and multiply it by the number they're buying. So for example, 2001, you had $1 per hot dog and they bought 4 hot dogs plus $2 per hamburger times 2 hamburgers, you have $8. 2002, it was $2 per hot dog times 4 hot dogs plus $3 per hamburger times 2 hamburgers, so the grand total of the basket was $14. You can see in 2003 how that was calculated as well. Now, we're going to go ahead and choose 1 year as a base year, which is 2001. We're going to go ahead and compute the consumer price index in each year. So remember, the consumer price index is equal to the basket in 1 year divided by the basket in the earlier year times 100. And so in 2001, the price of the basket cost $8. And 2001 is the base year, so it's going to be $8. So it's $8 divided by $8 times 100, and you have 100 as your CPI there. So you can see that is the major reason why the base year is always going to be 100, is because the price of the in 1 year and the base year are going to be the same, so that's going to give you 1 times 100, and you get 100. Now, moving on to 2002, there the basket of goods cost $14 divided by the price in the base year, which was $8 times 100, you get 175. 2003, the basket of goods cost $20, and then divided by the cost in the base year, which was $8 times 100, and you get 250 as your CPI. Now, after you figure out your CPIs, you can pretty easily compute your inflation rates from year to year. So remember that your inflation rate is equal to CPI 2 minus CPI 1 divided by CPI 1 times 100. CPI 2 is the later year, and CPI 1 is the earlier year. So you can see in 2002, your CPI was 175 minus the CPI in 2001, which was 100, divided by the CPI in 2001, which was 100, times 100, and you get 75%. In 2003, you had a CPI of 250 minus the CPI in 2002, which was 175. Remember, that's the earlier year, divided by the earlier year of 2002, which was 175 times 100, and you can see the inflation rate was 43%. So there's some numbers there. Hopefully that might make things a little bit more concrete. Now, next I want to go ahead and take a look at some of these problems in measuring the cost of living. The CPI is an accurate measure of the selected goods that make up a typical bundle, but is not a perfect measure of the cost of living. And economists will change up the CPI to try and make it a little bit more accurate. Like you have CPI headline versus core CPI. Core CPI is going to exclude prices like food prices, energy prices, because economists consider those too volatile. So we're going to focus in here on some of the problems that exist in the CPI. One of them being the substitution bias. So the basket does not change to reflect consumers' reaction to changes in relative prices. So just remember that consumers are going to substitute towards inexpensive goods. That isn't necessarily taken into account in the CPI. So therefore, inflation is going to be overstated. Doesn't necessarily count the switching to the more inexpensive goods. And so then you get the debate about what's called chaining the CPI, so the substitution bias can get taken into account. Another problem is we have the introduction of new goods. So the basket does not reflect the change in the purchasing power brought on by the introduction of new products. And then you have unmeasured quality changes. So if the quality of goods rises from one year to the next, the value of what you're buying, of the dollar, rises, even if the price of the good stays the same. So basically, you're going to get more for your money. At least a higher quality good for your money. Now, the substitution bias, introduction of new goods, unmeasured quality changes cause the CPI to overstate the true cost of living, usually by about 1% or so. And it's important to have an accurate CPI because the CPI is going to be used to adjust changes in the overall level of prices. So if you look at things like Social Security, which provides income to the elderly, it is what's called indexed to inflation, indexed to things like these CPI numbers. And so therefore, if basically the Social Security payouts to the elderly are going to go up every single year based on inflation, and if these inflation numbers are not estimated correctly, then the elderly are not getting paid a correct amount. Pension funds also have what are called cost of living adjustments. Those are usually indexed to inflation. And those will be inaccurate if inflation is not accurately measured. Now I want to talk about one other measurement of inflation, which is called the GDP deflator, and we're going to compare that with the consumer price index. So the GDP deflator is calculated as follows. It's going to be equal to the nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. So basically it deflates. It adjusts nominal GDP for inflation. So some differences with the GDP deflator. You're looking at goods that are produced domestically, currently produced goods, and how the prices are changing. And with the CPI, you're looking at a fixed basket of goods that people buy and how the prices are adjusting there. So there is a slight difference in terms of what the statistic is going to follow. Another important measure of price level changes is the PPI, the Producer Price Index, which measures the cost of a basket of goods that is bought by firms instead of individuals. All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to some of the effects of inflation in our next video.